Hello, boys and girls. We went over a new spelling rule this week. We were introduced to Ed. It says meet Ed. And because we've had a suffix lesson, we've had many, we know that ed, when we see ed at the end of words, we know that that is a suffix that stands for already happened, past tense. Well, we are going to learn that there are some spelling rules we need to take into account when reading words that have ed endings, and also when spelling words that have ed endings. Because Ed he can make three different sounds depending on the base word. So we're going to talk about that. When Ed is added to the end of a word, he sounds different depending on the base word. So whenever we are spelling a past tense word, we need to make sure that we are spelling it with ed and not these sounds that we hear. We need to be aware that when a word is turned into past tense and used in a past tense way, we need to make sure that when we hear sounds like id and just a d and a t, we know that when we write it and spell it, we need to represent those sounds with an ed and not the way it sounds. So that's what we're going to work on today. So Ed says id. You might hear a id sound when the base word, and a base word is that root word we've talked about when we learned about suffixes, is when a base word ends with a D or a T. So look at the word land. The word land ends with a D. So when we add ed to the end, it sounds like this. Landed, landed. The plane landed safely. So it sounds like an ID, but we don't spell it that way. Remember to use it as ED. We spell it with ED, even though it sounds like ID. And look at melt. The root word here is melt, and it ends with a T. So when we add ED, it's going to sound like this. Melted, melted. The ice cream melted away. So it sounds like id, but we spell it with ED. ED also just says d, but remember, even though we just hear d, we need to make sure we're spelling the words with an ED at the end. So when base words have endings that are voiced, meaning that your vocal cords are vibrating. So say z and touch your throat. Z, like in the word buzz. So at the end of that base word, you have a voiced hard consonant. That means your vocal cords are vibrating and you can actually hear it. You can actually feel it. So whenever we have a voiced hard consonant that makes our throat vibrate, when we add ed to the end of those words, it just has a d sound. So like buzzed, spelled. But although we just hear d, we need to make sure we are spelling that with an ed. So hard voice consonants that are at the end of those base words, whenever we have that and we add ed, we hear a d sound. And then Ed can also say t. I know. So many sounds, right? So when a base word is unvoiced, meaning it's an air consonant like the letter P, you don't need your vocal cords to make that sound. Or a K sound, k, 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 k. It's very soft and it's an air consonant. So whenever we have an unvoiced consonant at the end of our base word, like in the word jump, it has P, it's like a soft air consonant. It's going to sound, ed is going to sound more like a T sound at the end. So it's jumped, jumped, asked, asked. Some other examples, kissed, We don't need our vocal cords to say that s sound. So it's going to be soft, and the base word ending is soft. So our ed ending is going to be soft too as well with that t sound. You might also notice that in words like lash, and we say lashed, lashed. He lashed out at me. Notice that sh is an unvoiced air consonant. So we're going to take a look at this. I'm going to exit out of this. We're going to take a look at this as a sort here. Now, our target this week is that I can spell words with the suffix ed, okay? Even though we might hear those sounds t, id, and just a d, we know that when we hear that in a past tense word, that we are spelling it correctly. We are using ed to spell those words, not id, and not just d. So here are a few more examples of this rule. Fixed, barked, baked, dressed, picked. It sounds like there's a T at the end, but there's not. There's ed. The reason why it sounds like a T is because of those unvoiced consonants that we hear in the end of that base word. Here are examples of ed sounding like id, want, id. Notice that root words or base words that end with a T or a D only sound like id. Wanted, planted, landed, needed. So if your base word has a D or a T at the end, then when we add an ed to make it past tense, that means that it's going to make like an ID sound. It's going to sound more like an ID, but we don't spell it that way. Even though it sounds like that, we don't spell it that way. Then we have ed endings that sound like just d, okay? Now, even though we just hear a D, we spell it ed. So these are for those voiced consonants we hear at the end of the base words like call, l. Notice that your vocal cords vibrate. Play, a, vibrates. Buzz. And so when we add ed to the end, buzzed, played, called, smiled, spelled. You just hear the d, okay? But remember, we don't spell it with just the d. We have our spelling with an ed. So that's what we did today in class. We also went to our Schoology assignment. I'm going to show you that. So here is your Schoology assignment that you have to do. And it's a color sort. And what you have to do is read each word. I'll read them out loud for you. And you have to color sort them. So ed words ending with ed that sound like they have a t at the end, we are going to color that star blue. We're going to color the stars that make the d sound red. And we're focusing just on the ending sounds. And we're going to color the stars that make the id sound green. So look at your highlighters here. Then you have to use those to color. I'm going to do one example for you. Let's do the example with color the stars that make the t sound blue. So we're just focusing on the ending here. So you tell me. Jumped, jumped. Notice that P here is an unvoiced consonant. That's that soft consonant sound. That's just an air consonant. When we put an ed at the end of a word that has an unvoiced consonant at the end of a base word, it makes a t sound. So jumped, right? So that's an example of how I would like you to color your star, or you could just circle it or put a line through it as long as you just color code it. Now, As for the other ones, I'm going to read them out loud, but when you do this assignment, I want you to read them out loud too, so you can decide for yourself. Is ed making the t sound at the end, or the d, or the id? Ready? Twisted, played, loved, hugged, landed, shipped, cleaned, ended, washed. Did you hear them? Now it's your turn. Complete this assignment and submit it. Also, along with this assignment, you have some red word practice. So let's take a look at those. Here you have red words. I have red word work. Because it is a short week, I just went ahead and gave you your red words to practice. I will have a lesson on your red words up for Async Wednesday. But let's take a look at those so you know how to read them correctly. So we have show, like I want to show you my favorite toy. Show. Then we have know. I know something that you don't know. Do you know the meaning of freedom? And then knew. I knew that. So show, know, and knew. Practice those words. You read it, type it, build it. We will discuss these words in detail for your Async Wednesday lesson. All right, get to work, kids. See you later.